All of my videos include a text version on the first link below the video. The text version of this video contains a lot of supporting links, as does the drop-down menu below the video. The following content may challenge your current opinion or beliefs, but before leaving the video because something presented makes you feel uncomfortable, I would encourage you to first ask yourself if it's true. There are two distinct, even impassioned camps of opinion regarding Zionism, with perhaps few folks numbered as indifferent in between. The church is also split over views regarding the subject of the return of Jews to Israel. Before delving into ancient history and legal title to the land, it's important to note that by the early 1800s, Israel had essentially been abandoned. This began when Jerusalem suffered a physical desolation in 70 AD, when the Romans sacked Jerusalem and threw down Herod's temple, every stone, just as Jesus had prophesied, and killed over 1 million Jews. The Romans went on to kill over 500,000 more Jews during the Bar Kokhba revolt less than 70 years later. And as if the following 500 years of continuing persecution of God's people as the Roman Empire declined wouldn't have been enough, an additional 1,200 years of physical and spiritual desolation was in store after Muhammad's followers seized Jerusalem in 639 while in the process of conquering nearly the whole known world during the Islamic First Jihad. During that 1,200 years of spiritual desolation of the Holy Land, and as if they intended to further perfectly fulfill prophecy by completing the physical desolation as well, the harem-keeping geniuses running Islam's Ottoman Empire imposed a tax on property based on the number of trees it contained. The predictable result was that folks cut their trees down to reduce their tax burden, resulting in the loss of millions of trees and subsequent desertification. Thus, the spiritual and physical desolation of Jerusalem was complete by the early 1800s in spades, as further evidenced by a near non-existent population. In A History of the Jews, Paul Johnson writes, between 1827 and 1839, largely through British efforts, the population of Jerusalem rose from 550 to 5,500, and in all Palestine it topped 10,000, the real beginning of the Jewish return to the Promised Land. That's a population of Israel of 10,000 after the population of Jerusalem had multiplied 10 times from 550 to 5,500. Even 30 years later, in 1867, Mark Twain described it as a desolate country whose soil is rich enough but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. A desolation is here that not even imagination can grace with the pomp of life and action. We never saw a human being on the whole route. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of the worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. Of all the lands there are for dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. The hills are barren, they are dull of color, the valleys are unsightly deserts fringed with feeble vegetation that has an expression about it of being sorrowful and despondent. While the Jews began to restore the Promised Land a couple hundred years ago, the Green Movement was kicked off more formally in 1910 with the founding of the first kibbutz on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. About 600 years prior to the Christian era, Ezekiel prophesied regarding a desolation and restoration. And they shall say, this land that was desolate is become like the Garden of Eden, and the waste and desolate and ruined cities are become fenced. That's a map of the Israeli security fence. And are inhabited. Jerusalem, growing from a population of just 550 to over 750,000 people, with the population of Israel growing from 10,000 to over 7.8 million. That tiny strip of land emerging from total desolation as the Israelis advanced as world leaders in agricultural innovation and technology. The Gush Katif greenhouses alone produced about $200 million worth of exports per year. The community of Atzmona had Israel's largest plant nursery, and with 800 cows, the Katif dairy was the second largest in the country. If you're looking for a fairy tale ending, you're in for a disappointment. These industries were located on the Gaza Strip that the Israelis developed from desert wasteland over the last half of the 20th century. Secular international powers then brokered a deal in which the Gaza Strip was to be handed over to the so-called Palestinians in exchange for yet another empty promise of peace with the Israelis by Muhammad's followers that are committed to destroying the people of the book, just as Muhammad mass murdered them while also enslaving some and confiscating the fruit of their labor back then as well. The Gaza Strip's new owners were to take over operation and profit of the greenhouses, but instead, predictably, plundered and destroyed and abandoned them. Rather than producing food and flowers for export, the Palestinians instead used the Gaza Strip as a platform, now closer to Jerusalem, from which to launch thousands of rockets randomly into Jerusalem, as capable of hitting schools and hospitals as anything else. The greenhouses are abandoned today, and 4,000 high-tech greenhouse jobs the Jews provided for the Palestinians, churning out $200 million worth of produce a year, were turned into 500 farm jobs. Finally, a Palestinian charity tells the truth from Debbie Schulzel. A Gaza charity headed by the Interior Minister of Hamas yesterday offered $1.4 million to any Arab citizen of Israel who abducts an Israeli soldier. I wonder how many Christians funded that charity, believing they were helping Palestinians. Is it really a stretch to believe that funds sent to aid Palestinians are fungible, funding both welfare and bombs? Who keeps track of such funds? The Interior Minister of Hamas? If you want to help the downtrodden, why don't you help folks who deserve it, like those suffering in Africa, through organizations like Mercy Ships, Voice of the Martyrs, and Compassion International? In the Gaza town of Neve Daqlam today, Hamas turned the site into a barbed wire enclosed terror training camp from which Qassam rockets were launched into Israel. Signs posted in Arabic state that it is a closed military zone. Mahmoud al-Zar, chief of Hamas, said that Hamas planned to launch terror attacks that would drive the Jews out of the West Bank and the entire state. How many months, much less years, would you want your government to restrain itself if bomb-carrying rockets were dropping into your neighborhood? Terror only intensified when Israel completely and fully withdrew from the Gaza Strip. It wasn't until 2 years after the withdrawal, 2 years of continued rockets, that a blockade was finally put up to prevent the smuggling of those rockets. So rather than $200 million worth of produce, the export of Palestinian residents of Israel today is terrorism, as detailed in their own words through countless websites and videos on YouTube. Start with the YouTube search like Islam Indoctrination of Children. Besides being highly productive as an inherent part of the nature of Jews, another reason the Israelis have been able to become so innovative, productive, and prosperous as compared to their Islamic neighbors is because they are the only democracy in the Middle East that champions the freedom and right to self-determination of its citizenry that also shares our Western values. That's also why Muslims enjoy more freedom in Israel than they do in any Islam-controlled country on earth. The blessing the Jews have been on all our families was prophesied. And I will make of thee, Abram, a great nation, Israel, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great. And thou shalt be a blessing, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee all families of the earth be blessed. Let's compare the people of the book to Muhammad's followers in terms of Nobel Prizes to get a little better understanding of how the Jews have been a blessing on all families of the earth. The global Islamic population is approximately 1.5 billion, or about 25% of the world's population. They have received the following Nobel Prizes: Literature, 1, Peace, 3, Economics, none, Physics, none, Medicine, 1, Chemistry, 1. That's a total of 6, with half of them for so-called peace, even including one awarded to the terrorist Yasser Arafat. The global Jewish population is approximately 14 million, or about 0.2% of the world's population. Yet they compose 22% of all individual recipients of Nobel Prizes worldwide between 1901 and 2009. 10 for literature, 8 for peace, 53 for physics, 13 for economics, 43 for medicine, 24 for chemistry, for a total of 151. When was the last time you bought something that was made in the Middle East? Except for crude oil, and even that was produced by foreign companies from democratic nations. This is because rather than joining the rest of the world in striving to create a better life for future generations, the leaders of Muhammad's followers focus on denigrating Jews and spending their wealth on arms and armies to kill them, wipe them out to the last, and drive them into the sea. These are the true fundamental followers of Muhammad and leaders of Islamic nation states and mosques that get Islam and do what they can to do as Muhammad did. Don't take my word for it. Do a YouTube search like Islam killed Jews to hear it in their religious leaders' own words. Or read the Quran and Hadith for yourself, free online. Try word searches on those resources like fight and jihad. Even here at home, do a web search, U.S. mosques jihad. Whose side are you on?